Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a crowd followed him and pressed on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that the power had gone from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The gospel of the Lord. Oh, Christ. As you already know, the context of a story really matters to understanding the meaning of the story. If we interpret this particular story based on our own fast-paced, constantly multitasking 21st century context, we're likely to get it all wrong. The idea that Jesus dealt with an interruption on his way to Jairus' house, we would see as no big deal, but it was a big deal. Now, things have changed in how we deal with interruptions. We expect them. In defense of this particular premise, I would observe how we have allowed, or at least many of us have allowed, the cell phone to command our immediate attention. No matter the importance of what I'm doing, it seems to take precedent. I tell myself I can multitask, I can stay focused on my task at hand and still take that call. At least I think I can. And as an aside right now, I'm going to admit that I forgot to put my phone on silence this morning. So we may get a test of this through our service. I hope not. But society seems to expect us to be able to do this multitasking thing. Scholars tell us that this would have been totally incongruent for a first century person, a society of people at a much slower pace. To that first century person, this story, with its two main characters running one literally on top of the other, competing for Jesus' attention, one literally speaking over the other, would convey a sense of urgency, but also frantic energy and just be plain confusing. Confusing, except maybe for Jesus, who seems perfectly comfortable, neither frantic nor confused with this multitasking request. Which leads to the first reminder from our text this morning, that being, God is the ultimate multitasker. God is never too busy to hear our prayers and respond to our pleas. Perhaps responding in amazing and unexpected ways, or in ways that we do not yet understand. From our perspective, God is the ultimate multitasker. Yet we need to go back to the core of our story here today and these two miracles. After doing a healing on the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus once again crossed back over to the Jewish side, or Jewish territory. Now, this is not necessarily friendly territory for someone who has been associating with Gentiles and defying all the Jewish religious hierarchy. Yet still a crowd gathers for his teaching by the sea. And a ruler of the synagogue named Jairus approaches Jesus. Now, such leaders were not necessarily a priest, but they were highly esteemed and often well-to-do individuals. Jairus recognizes Jesus as a healer, motivated by his dying daughter. He, a man of honor, Jairus, renders unusual honor to a traveling preacher by falling at his feet. He appeals to Jesus, saying his daughter is at the point of death. Jairus believes that Jesus can lay on his hands on the girl and she will be made well and live. In his Jewish experience, this made sense. Laying on of hands was within his experience, part of sacrifice, part of blessing and ordination. He knows Jesus has used this practice in restoration of physical health and spiritual salvation. In this case, Jesus does not respond with words, but demonstrates his compassion for Jairus by his action of immediately following him towards his home. And the large crowd follows. Now we have the story within the story. Out of this large crowd pushes another petitioner, but not in a public way. This was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhaging for 12 years. We get almost too much information about this person. She spent all the money she had on many physicians, just likely getting bilked by them because she only grows worse. She is unclean and an outcast of society. She hears about Jesus and seeks him out. In contrast to Jairus' religious grounding and expectation of a very visible act, laying on of hands, resulting in healing, she perhaps has a more magical understanding of Jesus' healing power. For she says to herself, even if I just touch his garments, I will be healed. For her, the healing will be very private, likely known only to her. She, this unclean woman, has the audacity, without his permission, mind you, to reach out and touch this man. And she did, and she was healed. Although unseen by the world, Jesus knows his healing power has been tapped, but not knowing by whom. He asks his disciples around him, who touched me? Well, in a jostling crowd pressed against Jesus, they are just as clueless as usual. Yet the woman comes out of the crowd and comes forward to make public her desperate private searching for healing. So many contrasts here between these two stories. Unlike the esteemed synagogue ruler, this unclean woman comes from the very fringe of society. Yet, like the ruler, she falls at the feet of Jesus to pay homage and seek his mercy for her touch. We need to know a touch from a woman would make Jesus ritually impure. If he were to follow the conventional rules and laws of cleanliness, this woman's touch likely would end his trip to Jairus' house. However, Jesus, as Jesus often does, shows very little concern about touching and impurity and shows much more concern about mercy. Thus, he calls the unnamed woman daughter and says, "Your faith has made you well." He sends her away in peace because her faith has made her healthy from her illness. Note, in this way, Jesus provided a very public acknowledgement of a private healing, in contrast to what we will see with Jairus' daughter. Now we go back to the Jairus' daughter part of the story. News comes that she has died. The messengers do not address Jesus, a mere carpenter and healer. The messengers address their boss, their superior. But Jesus overhears. Jesus urges the ruler, as he did the woman, do not fear, only believe. Or said another way, don't listen to them, just trust me. In yet another switch, at this point, Jesus moves from public to private healing. He leaves the crowd behind, taking only Peter, James, and John. At the home, the casseroles have already begun to arrive and professional mourners have taken over. Jesus' comments about the girl merely sleeping is greeted with laughter. Jesus simply dismisses these non-believers and maintains a very private moment. Taking the girl's hand, he addresses her. The young girl rises and is restored to her family. But Jesus is not through. He instructs to keep quiet about what happened here in this private healing. Well, we made it to the end of another chiasm. It's important to consider both of these stories together. The notable parallels and contrasts bring a richness to the stories that looking at one at a time just simply cannot do. Similarities include both victims of illness are female and ritually unclean. One as a result of death and one as a result of hemorrhage. Both represent the significance of the number 12 in Jewish traditions, the 12 years of the hemorrhage and the 12-year-old girl. Both are regarded as daughters. The little girl being Jairus' daughter and a woman who is addressed by Jesus as daughter. Lastly, an act of touch restores both women to new life, even as those surrounding them lack understanding of what just happened. Of course, there are two notable contrasts as well. The story very publicly respected and highly visible Jairus, his story ends in a very private healing. The story of the marginalized woman, very private healing, becomes very public example of Jesus' love. In these two stories, we have both similarities and contrasts to help us see the range and the reach of the message of this man called Jesus. These sandwich stories explain each other and at the same time challenge we, the readers, toward an emerging vision of not just healing, but the new creation announced by Jesus. If Jesus is to be our model, one question for us from these stories has to do with or who or what claims our time and attention, and how we determine the worthiness of those people and things that claim our time and attention. Think further about who Jesus chooses. Consider, did he choose for political reasons or for economic reasons? Did he choose the best plan to promote his earthly ministry? No. Jesus chooses in this text cases to be instructive for us. It is clear that those who are most deserving of our attention may be the least visible ones. The female child, despite importance to her father, and the ill woman are not among those highly regarded by their social context of their day. Jesus acts here, as he does so often, transcending social and religious barriers in order to carry out his ministry. Both women are deprived of power, but Jesus, in his compassion, sees their needs and deems them just as worthy of his attention as anyone else. Jesus would have us recognize all are worthy. A second question for us has to do with all the other people in these stories. Yes, we learn from and celebrate with the main characters that Jesus heals. However, we have the crowds, we have the father, the friends, the professional mourners, the people young and old alike. They are all part of the story as well. We, the people, are to know that Jesus' healing power goes beyond mere fixing, mere restoration of physical life. In his actions, it is demonstrated that all are loosed from death and invited into the new creation going forward. You and I are among those invited through faith into that new creation. Finally, the ultimate question of what does it mean to be healed? For the woman, for the child, we have happy visible outcomes. But we know that that visible physical healing is not always the reality of our own lives. We know even our most earnest pleas do not always result in the answers we desire. Furthermore, we know that those visible healings were only temporary, just for now. Yet, we can proclaim Jesus as ruler over all things, the one whom heaven and earth does not limit. The one we learned before, even the wind and the sea obey. A reality we claim and we know by faith. Faith built by the visible story, like these two healings. Healing as peace in Christ. Healing even in the face of disappointment, as awareness of continuing presence of God in our times of despair continues. Healing so that through his grace, we will ultimately be with God. Once again, at the end of these stories, we are left with just a bit of a wonder at Jesus' command to not tell anyone about these events. Personally, I think he does that with a wink. He knows what will happen when a 12-year-old returns outside to play rather than for a funeral. He knows what will happen. Ultimately, we are invited to continue to ask where the story intends to lead us. What will it be like to follow Jesus on the journey of discipleship? In what way will our lives be transformed by this one whose words call us to stop being afraid and instead to live healed by faith? Live in the promise of the good news of God's kingdom among us, and live in the promise of God's kingdom to come. God's love for God's creation is strong. In Jesus, we have the audacious hope that one day all will be well as God restores creation to a place of peace and justice. May it be so. Amen.